The man stood up slowly. He did not raise his hand first. He did not wait to be called on. He simply stood in the fourth row of the Tonight Show studio with the particular careful steadiness of a man who has learned to trust his body in spaces he cannot see. One hand on the seat back in front of him, the other at his side, his face turned toward the stage with the stillness of someone who has been listening so hard for so long that listening has become its own kind of sight. Jimmy Fallon saw him and stopped talking. Not a pause, not a beat. He stopped the way a person stops when something reaches them before they have had time to decide how to respond to it. Completely. Mid-sentence, one hand still raised from a gesture he never finished making. The guest on the couch turned to look. The band stopped. And in the silence that opened up in Studio 6B on a Thursday night in October 2023, a blind veteran in the fourth row said 7 words that nobody in that building, nobody in the production booth, nobody behind the cameras, nobody sitting in any of the other 299 seats, had any way to prepare for. 7 words. And the entire show stopped. It was a Thursday night taping. October 2023. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon, Rockefeller Center, New York. The guest was a well-known actor promoting a new film. The segment was going well. The room was warm and full and loose in the way that good tapings get loose when everything is working. Jimmy Fallon was at his best, leaning forward, laughing, giving the guest space, pulling the audience in. A routine night. The kind of night that produces good television without anyone trying too hard. The blind veteran in the fourth row had arrived with a woman who appeared to be his daughter. A woman in her 40s who had guided him to his seat with the practiced ease of someone who has done it 10,000 times, who knows exactly how much room he needs and where the armrest is and when to let go. He was wearing a dark jacket, a military pin on the lapel, small, the kind that does not announce itself. His eyes were still behind dark glasses. He sat with his hands folded in his lap and his face turned toward the stage, and he was completely, utterly present. The way people are present when they cannot rely on visual distraction, and so have given the room everything they have. He had not done anything unusual. He had laughed when the room laughed. He had been still when the room was still. He was, to every outward appearance, simply an audience member, one of 300 people there to watch a television show on a Thursday night in October. And then, during a pause in the interview, while Jimmy Fallon was reaching for his cards and the guest was taking a sip of water and the room was doing the comfortable nothing that rooms do between moments, the man in the fourth row stood up. Not loud, not performative, not a disruption. He stood, and he turned his face toward the stage, and he said, into the accidental silence, into the gap between one moment and the next, 7 words in a voice that was quiet and steady and absolutely certain. The voice of a man who had been waiting a very long time to say something, and had decided tonight was the night. The entire studio froze. Jimmy Fallon did not move. His hand was still reaching for the cards. It stopped there, suspended, and did not continue. The guest on the couch set down the water glass very carefully and did not pick it up again. Questlove's sticks rested across the snare. The floor director stood with his clipboard lowered, not moving, not speaking. Because there are moments in live television when the job of managing the room becomes irrelevant. And this was one of them. Was something wrong? Had the man become disoriented? Was there a medical concern? The audience held its breath in the particular way of people who are frightened of drawing attention to their own presence, who understand instinctively that the wrong movement might break something they cannot name. The man's daughter had both hands on the armrests of her seat. She was looking at her father with an expression that was not alarm. It was something closer to recognition, the expression of someone watching something happen that they always knew would happen someday and had not known it would be tonight. Jimmy Fallon found his voice. It was barely above a whisper. He said, "Sir, I'm listening." And the veteran said the 7 words again. This time the whole room heard them. People held their breath. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in the spring of 1993. Jimmy Fallon wasn't always Jimmy Fallon, the host, the institution, the man whose laugh has soundtracked 30 years of late-night television. In the spring of 1993, Jimmy Fallon was 18 years old, living in Saugerties, New York, a small town in the Hudson Valley where he had grown up the son of a Vietnam veteran who had come home from the war quieter than he had left and had never fully explained why. Jimmy was a year out from high school, working jobs that didn't matter while he waited to understand what did. He had always wanted to be on Saturday Night Live. This was not a vague ambition. It was a specific and slightly embarrassing one that he kept mostly private because the distance between Saugerties, New York and 30 Rockefeller Plaza felt, at 18, like the kind of distance that only certain people crossed, and he was not yet sure he was one of those people. He performed wherever he could. Local open mic nights, a comedy club in Woodstock, a church talent show that he has mentioned once in an interview and never mentioned again. He was developing the thing that would eventually make him famous: the impressions, the physical comedy, the instinct for warmth, the ability to be genuinely present with another person that reads, on television, as something almost alarmingly sincere. But in the spring of 1993, none of that had been confirmed yet. He was just a kid from Saugerties, doing impressions in rooms that weren't always sure why they should be laughing. On the 3rd Friday of April 1993, Jimmy Fallon performed a 20-minute set at a VFW hall in Kingston, New York, a Veterans of Foreign Wars post that held monthly events and had, through some chain of favors and local connections, ended up with a teenager doing comedy on a Friday night for a room full of men in their 40s, 50s, and 60s who had served in Korea and Vietnam, and who were, collectively, not the most obvious audience for an 18-year-old from Saugerties doing celebrity impressions. He was terrified. He has said this, not about this specific night, because he has never spoken about this specific night publicly, but about this period in general. The terror of standing in front of a room that might not receive you. The terror of the joke that lands in silence. The terror, specific to that age, of not yet knowing whether you are what you believe yourself to be. He walked to the front of the room and he started performing. And the room was polite and not much more than polite. And he was 12 minutes in and aware with the particular acuity of a performer in trouble that he was losing them. That the gap between the room and whatever he was doing was widening rather than closing, when a man in the second row laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a courtesy laugh, a real one, sudden, unguarded, the kind of laugh that a person does not decide to produce, but that happens to them. The laugh of someone who has been caught off guard by genuine delight. The room shifted. When one person laughs that way, really laughs, the room takes permission from it. 2 more people laughed. Then 5. Then the room was with him, fully and without reservation, and the remaining 8 minutes were the best 8 minutes he had performed in his life to that point. After the set, the man from the second row found him at the side of the room. His name was Walter Gaines. He was 46 years old. He had served 2 tours in Vietnam with the 101st Airborne Division and had come home in 1971 with a Purple Heart, a hearing aid in his left ear, and a grief that he had never found adequate language for. He had been working as a mechanic in Kingston since 1972. Steady work, dependable work. The kind of work that fills the hands and leaves the mind available for either peace or its opposite, depending on the day. He was a quiet man. His wife had said once that he laughed maybe 3 times a year, and that when he laughed you knew something had genuinely gotten through, because nothing got through that hadn't earned it. He looked at Jimmy Fallon for a moment. Then he said, "You've got something, son. I want you to know that. You've got the thing that makes people feel less alone. Don't stop." Jimmy Fallon was 18 years old. He said thank you, the way 18-year-olds say thank you, inadequately, quickly, without yet understanding what the thing being given to them is worth. Walter Gaines went home. Jimmy Fallon drove back to Socrates. But he did not forget those words. He carried them into the years that followed. The rejections and the callbacks, and the Saturday Night Live audition that failed, and then the second audition that didn't. He carried them through the first season at Snell, and the early years of The Tonight Show, and the nights when the show was hard, and the room was cold, and he had to reach for something underneath the performance, to find the reason to keep going. On those nights when the doubt came, and it always came, he heard a voice from the second row of a VFW hall in Kingston, New York, saying a thing with absolute certainty that he was only beginning to learn might be true. Don't stop. He had thought about trying to find Walter Gaines. Twice over the years the thought had risen clearly enough to act on, and twice the busyness of the life he was living had absorbed the thought before he could follow it. He told himself there would be time. He told himself the moment would present itself. He told himself the things that people tell themselves when they are postponing something that matters, because the present is too full to hold anything more. Walter Gaines had retired from the garage in 2008. He had been diagnosed with macular degeneration in 2011, a progressive loss of central vision that had moved faster than the doctors initially projected, and that had taken, by 2015, essentially all of his functional sight. He had adapted with the same steadiness with which he had adapted to everything else the years had brought, with his hands, with his other senses, with the particular orientation of a man who has survived things that required him to trust his instincts when nothing else was available to trust. He still watched, in the way available to him, The Tonight Show. His daughter, who lived with him, and who had grown up with Jimmy Fallon's face on the television in their living room in Kingston, would sit with him and describe the visual elements he could no longer access. They had done this for years. It had become, over time, something they both looked forward to. In September 2023, Walter's daughter had applied for Tonight Show audience tickets. She had not told her father. She had thought, with the instinct of a daughter who knows her father's history better than he has ever fully shared it, who has seen the expression on his face certain nights when certain things happen on the screen, that being in the room might mean something different than watching from a distance. She had not known what would happen when they got there. She had hoped only that it would be good for him, that it would give him a night that was more than the ordinary. She had not anticipated what he would do when he got there. He had not told her he was going to stand up. He had not planned it, not exactly. He had simply been sitting in the 4th row of Studio 6B, with his face turned toward the stage, listening with the full attention of a man who has been listening to Jimmy Fallon's voice on a television in Kingston for 20 years. And at a certain moment, in the pause, in the gap, something in him that had waited 30 years decided that 30 years was long enough. He stood up. He said 7 words. Behind the scenes, no one had made any arrangement. There was no coordination, no producer briefing, no segment plan. What happened in Studio 6B that Thursday night in October 2023 happened because a blind veteran in a dark jacket and a military pin decided on his own, in a gap between television moments, that there was something that needed to be said. Jimmy Fallon had not known Walter Gaines was in the audience. His team had no information about him beyond the standard audience registration, name, contact, seat assignment. The fourth row, center section, aisle seat for accessibility. When Walter stood and said the 7 words the first time, Jimmy Fallon had not heard them clearly. He had heard a voice, and he had heard the quality of it, the steadiness, the certainty, the weight of something long carried, and he had done the only thing that instinct allowed him to do. He had said, "Sir, I'm listening." And Walter Gaines, standing in the fourth row with one hand on the seatback and his face turned toward the stage with 30 years of quiet faith in his expression, said the 7 words again. I was at Kingston VFW in 1993. Jimmy Fallon's hand, still suspended over the cards, came slowly down to the desk. He looked at the fourth row. He looked at the man standing there, the dark jacket, the military pin, the dark glasses, the stillness, and something moved across his face that was not an expression he had ever worn on television before. Recognition, but slower than recognition. The recognition of something the mind has to work to confirm, because the body has already confirmed it. He said, barely audible, "You laughed." Walter Gaines said, "I laughed." But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Jimmy Fallon stood up from behind his desk. He walked around it. He crossed the studio floor to the fourth row, and he did not slow as he reached the aisle, and he did not stop at the edge of it. He stepped into the row. He moved past 3 people who pulled their knees aside without being asked, who understood without being told that this was not the moment to be in the way. He stopped in front of Walter Gaines. He said, his voice not quite holding together, "I have thought about that night 100 times." Walter Gaines turned his face toward the sound of his voice. He said, quietly, "I know you have. It's in the work." Jimmy Fallon looked at this man, at the military pin, at the dark glasses, at the hands folded with a lifetime's practiced steadiness, and he said, "I never got to tell you. That laugh saved the set. That one laugh. I was losing the room and you laughed and the whole room came back to me." Walter Gaines said, "You didn't need the room. You had the thing before the room came back." A pause. Jimmy Fallon said, his voice breaking, "Why did you come tonight?" Walter Gaines said, "Because my daughter brought me." And because, his voice dropped slightly, the way voices drop when they are carrying real weight. "Because I wanted you to know that I was right. What I said to you in 1993. I wanted you to know that I have watched you for 30 years and I was right." His daughter, still in her seat, pressed both hands over her mouth. Jimmy Fallon did not speak. He could not speak. He stood in the fourth row of his own studio with tears running down his face, and the 18-year-old from Saugerties, and the man from the second row of a VFW hall in Kingston collapsing into the same moment, 30 years folding into nothing. And he put both arms around Walter Gaines and held on. Walter Gaines's hands came up slowly and held on in return. Questlove did not play. The cameras held wherever they were pointing. The guest on the couch sat completely still, with both hands in their lap. The producer in the booth did not speak into the headsets. The floor director stood at the edge of the studio with his clipboard at his side and let 30 years resolve itself in the fourth row without anyone's management. 300 people were on their feet. Not applauding. Just standing. Bearing witness. Because some moments are not for applause. They are for standing up and being present in the same way that a blind veteran from Kingston stood up and was present, completely, without reservation, trusting that the room would be equal to what he was bringing into it. It was. Walter Gaines and Jimmy Fallon spoke for 20 minutes after the taping ended. In the studio, after the audience had filed out, with Walter's daughter sitting beside her father and a producer standing quietly at the edge of the room, who had been told to wait and was waiting. Walter asked questions about the show, practical, specific questions. The questions of a man who has been listening to something for 30 years and wants to understand the mechanics of it. Jimmy Fallon answered every one. Walter Gaines passed away in March 2024, 5 months after the taping. He passed at home in Kingston, New York, in the house he had lived in since 1972, with his daughter beside him. She has said that in his final weeks he was peaceful in a way she had not seen in him before, lighter, somehow, as though something he had been carrying had been properly set down. She still watches The Tonight Show. She watches it the way they used to watch it together, with the sound up, paying attention, not missing things. Jimmy Fallon addressed Walter's passing briefly, privately, in a message to the family. He did not do it on television. Some things are not for television. He knew that Walter Gaines would have understood exactly why. The military pin that Walter wore that night, small, the kind that does not announce itself, was a pin from the 101st Airborne Division. His daughter has it now, on a shelf in the house in Kingston, beside a photograph from the taping that a crew member printed and sent to them without being asked. In the photograph, you cannot see Jimmy Fallon's face. You can only see his back, his arms around a blind veteran in a dark jacket, and Walter Gaines' hands, steady, certain, holding on with the same steadiness with which he had done everything in his life that mattered. Some people tell you the truth about yourself once, early, when you most need it and least know how to receive it. And then they wait 30 years, quietly, faithfully, to let you know they meant every word.